Kia ora everyone, thank you for the quick break. So we have Sarah, Matthew, Alec, Johnny and Martin. If you could all just introduce yourselves when you start speaking as well, for those via Skype would be helpful, but we will lead off with the presentation o te tāruki tāwhiri, so exciting, thank you.
Tēnā koe, Richard. Ko te mea tuatahi me whahoki te mihi ki a koe, nau tātou I whakatau I a tātou e tai mai. Nō reira kai te mihi aki ki a koe, o tiraki nā memo o te kaunihira o Tāmaki Makaurau, a mihi mai karanga mai ki a mātou ko ta tū mai nei. Nō reira tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Martin Timoni representing Ngāti Whanau, I just wanted to thank you for the welcome this morning, Councillor Richard, and to the Council for allowing us to present this morning. Nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Martin Timoni representing Ngāti Whanau, one of the mana whenua of Tāmaki Makaurau.
Tēnā tātou o te committee whakahaere. Hoani Freeland, Johnny Freeland, Untitled Chapter, and here on behalf of the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum alongside Martin. So kia ora.
Kia ora Martin, kia ora Johnny. Thanks everybody. Hopefully you all know me, Alec Tang, Acting Chief Sustainability Officer. Along with Johnny and Martin, I have Matthew to my left, Matthew Blakey, who leads climate mitigation, so emissions reduction for council, and Sarah Anderson, who has been leading the development of the climate plan. And as we say in this slide, and as you've heard already today, many others involved in the development of the plan to date. So really want to acknowledge everyone and acknowledge the public input that we just had. Just wanted to walk through a few really quick slides. I know we've talked the councillors through this many times. Largely, it's going to be a bit of a recap of the detail we've provided previously, where we've come from, what we're working towards, and then just some high-level slides about what's in the plan, and a bit more about implementation and prioritisation, the work that we've done to inform the next stages of the plan. Just going back, this has been quite an effort. We started almost 2 years ago, or over 2 years ago, with the refresh and review of low carbon Auckland, and did a whole bunch of development work in terms of underpinning research and evidence gathering to inform the plan, including reviews of best practice of global city climate plans, undertaken bespoke emissions reduction, emissions modelling, and then did the climate change risk assessment, which was launched back in February. You've all seen the plan in various forms through this development. You've also made a number of resolutions that we've highlighted here on this slide, including most recently, has been mentioned before, and notably that unanimous climate emergency declaration and the endorsement of an interim target of halving Auckland's emissions by 50% by 2030 and taking a precautionary approach to climate change. What this slide also highlights is that we've taken the local boards through this process at various points and engaged both directly through the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum as well with individual iwi at various points through the process, which I know Johnny and Martin will talk to a little bit. You will all have seen as well in the memo that was circulated last week the detail that's gone into this engagement with Māori broadly and Mana Whenua specifically. And over the last couple of weeks, following on a committee workshop that we had, I personally have reached out to all 19 iwi and have had direct conversations with over half of them, which have been really productive and really useful to recap on what we've been up to. The other thing I just wanted to flag on this is the engagement that we've had with the public. So we've had formal and informal input from Aucklanders throughout the process. We've had a formal consultation exercise that was undertaken between July and September last year. We had a crowdsourcing platform, those of you who might remember Climate AKL, which was a new way to try and generate ideas that created some of those actions. We've had subject matter expert workshops with industry, with civil society, with community groups and so on. And as was mentioned previously, we had that 3-day climate symposium which brought a lot of that information together. So a huge amount of work that's gone into the plan to date that's brought us here. A quick recap again of where we're going, and again, you've seen this slide before, but what we're looking at is what is a somewhat tiered approach to climate action, which looks at Te Tariki Tawhiri, the regional plan, which sets the vision, sets the direction, confirms those dual goals of reducing emissions and adapting to climate change, but has that longevity, has the focus on Tāmaki as well. It outlines our key priorities, the actions that will take us to these goals, and it is regional. So similar to the Auckland plan, it recognises that what we need to do to deliver on these goals is a collaborative effort. We need businesses, we need academia, we need all Aucklanders involved, we need government, mana whanua, mātou waka, everybody doing their part. The other thing just to note, it is integrated. So we've looked at emissions reduction and adaptation together because there are benefits from doing so, and there are also real risks if we don't. Within the plan, so the second square along, we have an implementation section that really is updated annually. So recognising that things change, and actually the environment we're living in is rapidly evolving. So new technology, changing perspectives, evolving action, new direction centrally and internationally. So that section is looking at roles and responsibilities, funding, financing, resource requirements. And then beyond the plan. So once we adopt the plan, hopefully today, we look at the implementation. And that sits both in terms of immediate actions, what we can prioritise, what we're already doing, or could easily be started within existing budgets, and then looking forward to that 10-year budget, the long-term plan, 2021, 2031, where we have been doing a whole bunch of work around costing those actions for consideration. That's where we're heading. As I said, our focus today is on the first couple of parts of that in terms of the plan and the implementation section. And with that, I will hand over to Sarah, who will talk about the plan.
So just a quick recap. Obviously, we've spoken to committee a few times about this, but just a quick recap of the structure before I hand over to Johnny and Martin to talk a bit, particularly in the Tāmaki Makaurau response section. So basically, we have Te Tariki Tawhiri, our climate plan. A Tāmaki Makaurau response is our foundation to the plan. It sets out the principles and the values and what needs to underpin the plan overall. Beneath that, we have our two core goals, one of which is reducing our emissions by 50% by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050, as agreed at last committee, and also preparing for change, which is our adaptation goal, where we take a precautionary approach to planning for change. Beneath those two goals, we set out our 8 priorities, which have action areas within them that will set to deliver those 2 goals. So at this point, I'd like to hand over to Johnny and Martin to talk about a Tāmaki Makaurau response, and particularly the work of the Kaitiaki Forum on Te Ora Tāmaki Makaurau.
Tēnā tātou. Firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the previous speakers, and especially our rangatahi and our elders and our pakeke that spoke, and what they spoke about was really relevant to the kaupapa of Te Tariki Tawhiri. And talking about those trees in Avondale, my dad went to Avondale College and he turned 80 this year. And some of those trees are his age and a bit older. And the significance is in Tāmaki Makaurau, we have less than 5% of our elders that are 65 years or older. So when we talk about the numbers of mature trees, we think about our elders and our ancestors in terms of who's left to help umbrella us and guide us. So I just really wanted to acknowledge the previous speakers and also the importance of elders. We have a saying when we lose a chief, kua hinga te totara i te wānui a Tāne, a great totara has fallen in the forest of Tāne. And we can't really say that in Tāmaki we actually have a forest other than in Hindu and Waitakere. So I just wanted to acknowledge those speakers and how relevant those topics are to the kaupapa of climate resilience. And for us as mana whenua, it's representation of our ancestors and our whakapapa of Tāmaki Makaurau. So, so in terms of leading for that, I just wanted to talk about the 2-year process up till now. And I think the engagement and the partnership that Auckland Council has undertaken with mana whenua, Māori community and rangatahi have been unprecedented in the 10 years of Auckland Council. And the numbers speak for that in terms of the number of engagements, over 4 key phases. And in the previous draft that went out for public consultation last year, around July, August, we had almost 30% of a Māori response through submissions that are unprecedented. That was literally 525 submissions. We created other mechanisms like Facebook and websites, and we partnered with Wātea Radio where they had a number of panel discussions that were live streamed. And so we had almost 3,000 views of Radio Wātea's live streams. We had 7,000 views of our Facebook page and over almost 40,000 views of the Te Tarukia Tāwhiri website. And that's just the Māori space. And so, the work that has been done, and really want to acknowledge the way that the Chief Sustainability Office has partnered with mana whenua through the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum. And also want to emphasise that the forum itself is not a representative body of mana whenua. The mana and authority sits with individual iwi. And so the conduit of the forum, in order for the 19 mana whenua to have a conversation and partner with council in such an important issue, I think the process and things we can always work on, but certainly the substance of the conversation has landed us together where we've been able to hold the pen to the Māori content in the climate plan alongside Alec and his team. Within that, I guess, and acknowledging COVID-19, because that has presented a challenging and an awesome opportunity for us to bring a sharp focus on the state of Māori and Tamaki Makaurau. And for us, in a 200-year context, if you like, climate change is just another issue for our people. And we continue to be resilient, but we continue to live in survival mode. And COVID-19 saw some key lessons where a Māori-led response supported by council was critical. It created an opportunity for our fundamental values around care, support, guardianship, held us together, which has held us together in this location for about 1,000 years. And a lot of wisdom that mana whenua in particular can share. And so being able to use Western science alongside Māori science has been quite critical in the way we've landed this climate work. And certainly the targets and measures for us are really important in the sense of creating, if we can reach those targets, it creates breathing space for Papatūānuku to regenerate herself. And one thing we saw in the bubbles, in the rāhui, in the lockdown of COVID-19, is a massive regeneration of nature. And a few weeks out of back into level 1, we've sort of seen the return back to almost the old normal. So a post-COVID environment creates an opportunity for us to, again, reimagine, reframe and reset the system. And in that thinking, we believe water is at the heart of that. Climate resilience is really critical, caring for our most vulnerable people, and a shift to a regenerative economy. And the challenges that councils had to do around landing the budget recently, it's sort of, our prioritisation needs to shift around what's important. And certainly at a family level, we saw what emerged as really important for our people and our bubbles. And so Te Tarukia Tāwhiri is really important in that context. It allows us, if you like, to reframe the priorities of Tamaki Makaurau using a climate resilience lens. We have gifted the name Te Tarukia Tāwhiri. It refers to two things. Te Taruki being a framework in a similar way of a crayfish pot, and it's more about the way the crayfish pot was woven together between mana whenua and council, so the climate plan is a framework. And the other key thing, Te Tarukia Tāwhiri, refers to the struggles of Tāwhiri Mātia, and Tāwhiri is our guardian of climate. And what we're seeing is the struggles of Tāwhiri to the impact of human behaviour. And COVID-19 is just another nudge from Papatūānuku to remind us as humans that we need to recenter and recalibrate back to looking after Papatūānuku. And just acknowledging too, Sunday finished our Matariki phase, our Māori New Year, which was a time to look back, a time to celebrate where we are now, and also a time to look forward. And the fact that this plan is being considered today for final adoption, it all sits in that context of change, reflection, and looking forward. So I guess the other key thing we wanted to touch on is one of those impacts we've seen is the potential increase for climate refugees. For 153 years, we've had to accept a number of refugees into Tamaki Makaurau, displaced Māori after the land wars, Māori in post-World War II coming from the rural areas to Tamaki Makaurau, where today every iwi of New Zealand lives in Tamaki. Our Pacifica relations that have migrated here, and then more recently our refugee people, our communities from going back to Vietnam in the 70s through to Somalia and Syria today. So Tamaki have always welcomed refugees or displaced people. It's really important as we look forward around how we look to welcome awhi, especially a lot of our relations from the Pacific. We share same whakapapa. And so we've got community systems and mechanisms in place that work well in COVID that actually can embrace that next wave, if you like. So those are our key points from my perspective. And anything from?
So thank you, Johnny. And all I'd like to sort of add to that is just picking up on some of the previous speakers talking about how important it is for a collaborative approach for the council, for the CCOs, and for our communities to be part of this particular the response to the climate change. So kia kaha rā tātou ki te tutuki pai, taua āhuatanga, nō reira tēnā koutou.
Kia ora, Martin. Kia ora, Johnny. Thank you. Sarah.
Kia ora. So just to walk through, obviously that sets fantastic foundations for a Tamaki Makaurau response. The other parts within that section are around really reiterating this is a regional plan and we need to work together. So it is that roles and responsibilities so we can all take action together across the region. It considers the diverse perspectives of Aucklanders. As Johnny mentioned, we had an unprecedented percentage response from Māori, and also thanks to our youth partners, including Gen Zero, where we had the highest numbers for youth responses as well. So we really did have great perspectives that we've also reflected within this response section. Delivers multiple benefits from climate action. Obviously, the actions that we're putting forward deliver wider social and environmental benefits, cultural benefits, and economic ones as well. And we need to maximise the value of every action that we take. Equity came through really strongly in our consultation response, so we've brought that much further up top and expanded further on that section as to how we need to consider equity in the actions that we take. And we also see it peppered throughout in the actions and sub-actions where we talk about targeting those most impacted. Gives voice to our rangatahi and youth. As you've heard, we've worked closely with rangatahi, and that is why there is a section entirely dedicated written by rangatahi to identify priorities going forward. And recognises our international, national and regional commitments that we've made across the years. So hand over to Matthew.
Tēnā koutou katoa. So as was pointed out earlier, this is an integrated climate plan. It addresses both climate change mitigation in terms of reducing emissions and climate change adaptation. I'm going to briefly highlight some of the key points around climate change mitigation, reducing our emissions. So firstly, our goal is to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. The goal of 50% by 2030 was voted for by this committee back in March. It was an update to the plan following consultation on the draft climate action framework last year. We received a strong response and a strong theme that we needed bold, rapid action and a strong interim target to reduce emissions by 2030. We've reflected that in the plan, hence the 50% by 2030 target. I just want to cover off 4 key points here. So within the plan, you will see there is a section dedicated to reducing our emissions, so to provide a bit further context around what we've done. The current emissions pathway that has been projected for Auckland suggests that we will increase our emissions by around 19% by 2050 if we do not take additional action to address climate change. That's based on estimated population increases and estimated growth factors across sectors and activities. So clearly our current emissions pathway is not in line with our climate goals. We have looked at our greenhouse gas emissions profile, which many of you will be familiar with by now, to understand where the opportunities to decarbonise lie. So looking at our greenhouse gas emissions profile, and in summary, many of you will know, if not all of us, that transport is our biggest emissions sector. 43% of our emissions are attributable to transport, 30% is attributable to private cars and light commercial vehicles, so nearly a third of our emissions. Stationary energy accounts for over 26% of our emissions, stationary energy being the energy used in residential and commercial buildings, and also manufacturing, with some energy attributable to agriculture as well. Industrial processes and product use account for just over 20% of our emissions profile, with steel production being 15% of our emissions profile, so fairly significant. Waste is around 3% of our emissions profile, largely emissions from landfill gas, with the agricultural sector accounting for around 6.5% of our emissions profile. So one thing to note is that Auckland's emissions profile is very different to New Zealand. New Zealand's emissions profile is around 50% agricultural emissions. We have around 6.5% agricultural emissions, from livestock, that is, and land-based emissions. One thing to also note is that New Zealand's emissions profile is around 20% transport. So by proportion, Auckland's emissions profile, transport accounts for double that of New Zealand on a proportional basis. So we've looked at our emissions profile and looked to understand it in detail. We've then set out to identify a decarbonisation pathway for Auckland to meet our climate goals. So to meet 50% by 2030 and transition towards net zero emissions by 2050. We've used the CURB tool, which is a tool developed by the World Bank in partnership with C40 cities to do this, and also relied on additional bespoke modelling, and informed by other studies that are taking place. One thing to note is that this is one combination of climate actions to deliver on these goals. There are obviously many. We have looked to identify the decarbonisation pathway that takes into account the opportunities and challenges of decarbonising each sector and activities within that sector. Therefore, each sector does not decarbonise by the same amount. In other words, each sector does not decarbonise by 50%. Certain sectors decarbonise at a greater rate. So, for example, transport and stationary energy decarbonise at around 65% by 2030. And certainly other sectors, so industrial processes and product use, decarbonise by just over 20% to reflect the challenges that are inherent in decarbonising industrial processes such as steel production. So the decarbonisation pathway for Auckland models a decarbonisation rate specifically for each sector. One thing to note is that although sectors decarbonise to different extents, the level of climate action for each sector is ambitious. It's bold and it's challenging. There's no denying that, but it reflects the opportunity that each sector has. One thing to also note is that we've modelled at 2050 a 94% reduction in emissions, so clearly that is not net zero. We recognise that additional strategies, additional innovation, perhaps new technologies will be required to hit net zero by 2050. This is common amongst other C40 cities in terms of understanding what will be required as we transition towards 2050. So just to flag that there will be a need for that. We have committed to monitoring our progress every year and also reconsidering our decarbonisation pathway every 3 years to reflect changes, to reflect progress and to reflect possible opportunities. One thing to note is that it's very clear that our decarbonisation pathway needs to peak and then rapidly decline. The longer we leave it, the more rapid that decline and the steeper that decline needs to be in order to hit the 2030 target in particular. Our decarbonisation pathway has been considered in the context of Auckland's carbon budget. I appreciate you've all been discussing budgets at length recently. Just to confirm, this is not a financial budget. This is associated with the cumulative total emissions that Auckland can produce to play its part in meeting the Paris Agreement. We have a carbon budget that has been assigned to us by C40 cities. It's equivalent to approximately 14 times the annual emissions in 2016, recognising that greenhouse gases are cumulative. So the quicker we decline, the more opportunity we have to stay within that budget. I won't go into any more detail there, but obviously happy to answer questions later. I will hand over to Sarah now.
So obviously our second goal is around preparing for climate change. I wasn't going to go into detail in this area because much of it is still within the framework and hasn't changed substantially from the framework because it's evidence we'd gathered before that point. So when we talk about Auckland's climate future, that section draws on the NIWA projections that were carried out, that we co-commissioned with the CCOs as well. And those draw down what climate change could look like for the Auckland region down to 5 kilometre squares under a range of emissions scenarios. So it gives us the best science that we have to date. We also undertook a climate change risk assessment technical report series. This was undertaken by our research and evaluation unit, and we were the first region in the country to do that piece of work. And so the climate risk talks about, so the projections talk about what might happen. The climate risks tell us a bit more about what it actually means for us as a region. And this section also talks to our approach for adaptation and the fact that we are focusing on dynamic adaptive policy pathways. And what this essentially means is we plan early and we plan collaboratively, but we make decisions as conditions arise rather than trying to make every decision today with regards to adaptation, recognising that there is uncertainty. And an example of this approach you're going to hear later in the agenda, where we talk about adaptive management to too much water. That is the similar kind of agile approach that we're talking about here. And then obviously we have our 8 priorities. These have all been informed by the emissions modelling, the risk assessment, and extensive collaboration and engagement with stakeholders across the region. So we have set out the 8 priorities, and within each of these areas we talk about what is our goal, why is it a priority, and how it aligns to our climate goals, indicators to help us track progress, and then what are the actions that we need to deliver against those priorities. We also include roles in delivery, and in the digital format, it enables us to pull together all related actions as well, so that people can look between priorities and manoeuvre between them.
So the final section, just to really fly through, is the implementation section, which, as I had said at the start, will be regularly updated, needs to be regularly updated because of advances in knowledge, changes in context, and lessons learned over time. Within the section that you would have seen, we do have a discussion about post-COVID-19, a number of opportunities, but also the focus on prioritisation. There's an implementation action table, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the next slide, but key here is setting out roles, partnerships, and funding financing options, as well as a set of indicators. So we heard this before in terms of needing to determine how well we're doing, both as the plan overarchingly, but also in terms of each action. In that table, you'll see each of the priorities, the high-level actions, and then a number of sub-actions. So how will we deliver on those various actions, and who is the lead for those sub-actions? We heard earlier, some of those are directly in council's control, or things for a council to lead. There are many that aren't, and we need the partnerships and we need the collaboration of other sectors to deliver. What we do state, though, in terms of the role of council, we have a role in almost every single one of those actions, whether it is to directly control it, to lever it, or to advocate for change. And we'll work with other partners to do this. What we've also tried to do in the implementation table is give a sense of the scale of greenhouse gas emissions reduction, how that aligns to our 2030 and 2050 targets, and also whether or not it contributes to adapting to climate change, addressing those risks. We've also highlighted the benefits, the broader benefits that these actions can deliver, acknowledging that climate action can deliver on a number of different goals around social, economic, and environmental and cultural outcomes. We also set out the indicators and a time frame for action, and also highlight a scale of resource need from low to high.
And as we've spoken about before, the final plan will be a digital plan, so very different to the written document you see in front of you, although the text will be essentially the same. The look and feel will obviously be different in a digital context. Readers will access that information in different ways according to interest, which is why you see different levels laid out in the document that you have in front of you. And we will require further development work to take place around infographics, multimedia, so that's why the document isn't a final designed document, obviously, and looking to launch that plan around October this year. So just to give a very high level, just to reiterate, it will obviously look different. And we've had some initial mock-ups done. I should say the photographs aren't set. All of that will come through in the design. But in a digital setup, it obviously looks more like this. This is what the homepage will look like, having the welcome, having that Tamaki Makaurau response, which will stand out from the other two goals, and then the priorities, so that people would click through to the more detailed information. So that was just to give a bit of a visual so you can have a better feel of what the plan will look like.
So just the final couple of slides. Obviously, as Sarah said, if we adopt today, then the plan text will be digitised for that plan. The structure of that site needs to be built as well. Hand in hand with this, and hence bringing this to you now, we've been working on costed actions for our contribution to delivering on this plan. And we need the direction from the plan in order to inform that LTP conversation. So we'll continue work. There is a whole bunch of stuff that I highlighted earlier, activity that's underway, that's part of BAU that will continue. There will be other stuff that we can get on with, and activity that is funded through that emergency budget, acknowledging that there are a number of projects and programs there. And then working with partners, and I think that's the critical part we've heard before, and there are a number of people involved in delivering on this plan. I just wanted to flag one last slide, which you've seen before, but which reiterates this iterative approach that we need to take to implementing climate action. We've had the emergency budget. We will have a number of LTP review cycles between now and 2030 and beyond to 2050, and that's the point where we review, we plan, we do, and we keep on evolving our response based on what's happening. That's all we had to say, and we'll table questions.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much. I've got questions coming in. My first question just is, and we had the two speakers earlier around, maybe it's a question for Matthew, on how we are measuring our emissions, how we measure reduction, and what targets are we putting in place. I guess for ourselves it is a bit more difficult with Auckland as a whole, but I guess if you could just reiterate our plans for that.
So just to confirm, our plans as a council, as Auckland Council, we have a target of 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. In terms of our corporate emissions, that's across Auckland Council and CCOs. We are addressing that through the ongoing long-term plan preparation. So in terms of understanding what is base case, what we can progress outside of the long-term plan, and then what we can put forward for consideration for long-term plan 10-year budget funding. We are looking to understand where we are tracking and what additional investment and activity is required to hit that target. So that's something that's underway and a core focus of the work in that area.
And so for instance, we put our the car fleet and the boilers themselves were 20% of our overall emissions for the council family. How are we measuring that, just to give people confidence that we're measuring our overall, and then there will be...
Yeah, just to note, we have an annual greenhouse gas inventory that we've been collecting for a number of years now, and that's independently verified. So we report on that internally. What we're actually looking to do now through our annual report disclosures, and you'll recall that in the most recent interim results, we started to disclose on climate-related financial risks. That inventory will then hopefully be part of those disclosures, so you can see scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, what is the inventory, and then to Matthew's point, what is our reduction approach. And just to note that TCFD, that Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, what we're looking to do in the annual report is to include disclosures from each of the CCOs as well.
So that's great work. So just wanted to confirm for those watching or listening that we are going to be quite transparent around our own emissions and targets, and if we're going up or down, and then how to address that too. Thank you. We have the first question from Councillor Casey.
Thanks, Richard. First of all, just to welcome Puki Tapapa Local Board Chair Julie Ferry and new board member John Turner, ardent environmentalist, and they're both here today to witness this significant milestone. And also congratulations to the Puki Tapapa Local Board for its own carbon action plan from way back 2018. My questions relate to that. I know this is the Auckland plan, but I'm interested in the Auckland Council family and their involvement in it. So 2 questions. One relates to local boards. If in October, when we pass this today and we have a digital plan, if I start at the top, do I eventually get to Puki Tapapa's local board action, climate action plan, low carbon plan? If I step through it, will it be there at the end? I'll give you the other question too. How has the involvement of all local boards been? Any holdouts? And I want to ask that of the CCOs as well, because that's come up a few times today. So any holdouts, who's doing good, who could do better? Thank you.
If I tackle it, and then Sarah might want to jump on the local board. So in terms of how the digital plan is structured, one of the things that we did here through consultation, whilst a lot of the things we said in the plan are very strategic and kind of systems level, we did hear from people going, well, what can I do? And so that's a big focus of the kind of reshape, the rejig, and then actually getting to that local board plan. I don't know particularly, but I think that would be a great idea to make that link if it isn't there already. So I think we can take that away. In terms of engagement, look, we went round to all local boards a number of times, and generally the conversation's been quite positive, sometimes surprisingly positive, but it was been really good. I think there's a general sense from all members that this is really an issue of interest to their communities. Now, how we deal with it, how we resolve it is very different between depending on different local boards, different communities, different sectors, and that's something that we've noted in the plan, that we can't have one approach to all communities, and so we need that local view. And just to go on to CCOs, look, the CCOs have all been part of the development of this plan through their sustainability managers, through other advisors as well. They are working with us on the LTP budgets in terms of, what is the scale of reduction that we could see with each of the CCOs. They each have their own challenges, and we're cognizant of that. I think we need to work through it. I think if I reflect on this, and I think I mentioned before, this plan will not succeed if people don't change the way they operate, organisationally, personally, and this will require quite significant change from us as council, from CCOs in terms of what the priorities are and the direction that we give in terms of where they need to focus. So there's been support. We've acknowledged that there are different challenges, different things that come in the way, but I feel like there is an understanding that this is a really important issue for Aucklanders that we need to get behind. I don't know if you wanted to add something.
I can just add a little on the local boards. So when we very first kicked off this process, we went to all 21 local boards and talked to them about climate change openly. What are people already seeing and what are the key issues? And we captured all of that together and we can share that report. And a lot of those issues that came through from local boards directly informed the actions that we're taking forward into the plan as well. We went back again around the framework and we went back again recently with regards to the proposed changes. And what was really fantastic is that despite COVID, local boards still provided resolutions to us and still gave feedback, but they supported the changes and also gave quite a lot of broader feedback, which again, we've taken forward into the plan as well. It's been very engaging.
Thank you, Councillor Casey. Deputy Chair, Pipicombe.
Kia ora, Mr Chair, tēnā koutou, Martin, Johnny, tēnā kurua. Thank you for the presentation and getting us to this point. I think you sat in on the, this is probably a question for you, Alec, the questions that we had from Generation Zero from Olivia, who presented, and I think it picks up on what the Chair also mentioned and tied into that. But the specific questions I heard was about how do we embed that responsibility across council and the CCOs? And I just wondered if you could respond to that. And also the other question around the funding. And I know that was, we've also touched on that too through the LTP. But if you just could perhaps respond to those questions that you heard in the presentation. Thank you.
I think, and just to, I think this was something that Councillor Casey, I neglected to add. What we've seen, and I think Grant raised it, was through the statements of intent, the letters of expectation, there was a request, I think, from the Mayor's letter asking for what people are doing, what CCOs are doing on climate change, and you know, the responses that I've seen are good. I mean, it's not like people haven't put things in. I mean, if I put my hat on, I'd say I'd like to see more. I'd like to see these CCOs go further. And, you know, words are great, but it's actually how you then make decisions and how does that funnel through. I know that CCOs are slightly different with their boards, but I've also looked to try and engage with the boards as well, because I think that's where you're going to see a lot of action come through in reality, where you've got strong chairs of those boards actually pushing through some of the decisions. So I think letters of expectation, statements of intent are good. It will be when we kind of go to the LTP, so that side of things where various projects will be put forward, and we'll need to put a strong scrutiny on whether they are actually taking us towards our climate targets or taking them further away. In terms of budgeting, look, we recognise the difficult financial environment that there's been. Matthew's raised that climate change doesn't go away because we don't have funds. Any decision that we make that keeps us on the same trajectory makes it even more hard, even more difficult to reduce in the future. So I think we've got to bear that in mind, particularly for that LTP, and that's where we focused our efforts in terms of saying, well, if we are going to hit 50% by 2030, then these are the things that we need to do as council. We also need to look to the private sector and to other actors as well, because there is capital out there. And we've been involved as council in the Aotearoa Circle, which I've mentioned before, in terms of identifying alternative funding and financing mechanisms, how we can blend finance together to deliver on these goals, because there are a whole bunch of other parties that have roles to play in the built environment, in the natural environment as well. So I know it's kind of, there's a lot there, but I think fundamentally it's about how do we actually drive the action coming out of this plan.
Just a supplementary, just to clarify further, because the specific question was around how's the funding going to be weighted to sufficiently ensure the targets are met. So just to clarify that you're saying that is the process that we will work through in the LTP. It's not just about funding everything, it's about also looking at where we can get most bang for buck, so to speak.
So yeah, and again, I suppose going into the LTP phase, we've been doing a lot of work in terms of impact assessments. So here are programs of activity. What's the actual emissions benefit? Does it address climate risk? And what are the other kind of environmental, social, cultural benefits that might result? The plan is that we'll put all that together into a package and obviously bring that to councillors for decisions. But yeah, that's the assessment that we've gone through or we're going through right now.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Councillor Walker.
Got a few questions. The first one goes to the graph that's on page 58 of our agenda, or 41 of the report, and it shows Auckland's annual gross emissions. There's a dotted provisional line there. I'm assuming that the provisional line is the line that's closest to reality.
So through the chair, just to confirm. So 2016 is currently the latest annual emissions inventory we have. We are certain of that. What we have then done to generate that provisional, the provisional estimates for 2017, 18 and 19 is take the 2016 inventory as a baseline and then look at the information, the data that we have that is complete, and develop a provisional inventory based on that. So, for example, we have data relating to transport emissions for 2017, 2018, 2019. We have data relating to other sectors, but we don't have certain sectors, so therefore we're applying the same baseline as 2016, where we have gaps in data. The reason we've done that was following a comment that was made at this committee previously that 2016 is 4 years ago. We recognise that. So we've done our best to bring together data with as much confidence as we can to identify what 2017, 2018, 2019 look like. We have a high level of confidence that 2017 is the dotted line is about right, because the sectors that generate most of our emissions we have data for.
So essentially what we've got is a provisional line that shows gross emissions are going up, which is of real concern. effectively that means that the curve or the line that we have to take to actually meet our targets becomes ever more difficult. So I just want to get clarity around that. The other question I've got, though, goes to page 49 or page 32 of the report, where it mentions our current emissions pathway references carbon sequestration from forestry. But then later in the report on page, I think 153, it mentions that we're not measuring that. So I just wonder how we can come up with something when we're not measuring it.
So, through the chair, we do measure carbon sequestration within our annual greenhouse gas inventory for the region. We follow the Global Protocol for Community Scale Greenhouse Gas Emissions. It's a standardised methodology for measuring city scale emissions. We measure carbon sequestration in terms of forestry. And there are certain criteria to measure that forestry. So certain criteria in terms of the area of the forest and in terms of the minimum width of the forest. But that's to say that's only some of the overall carbon sequestration in the region. We don't recognise in our inventory sequestration from the urban Ngāhere, for example, because it doesn't meet that criteria. We don't recognise sequestration, soil sequestration, for example, and other forms. So that may be where that mixed messaging is, and we can certainly look to address that to confirm and make sure there's no confusion. The point that I think is being made is that we don't currently understand and measure all of the sequestration in the region, and there may well be opportunities to enhance that through greater understanding and practices.
The other question I've got just goes to the back, where you mention roles and partnerships and so on. And I had a number of issues I raised the last time you presented around the absence of a number of things. For example, the Global Covenant of Mayors is not there, and we signed up to that. Len Brown signed up to that. There are also organisations like ICLEI that we have been a signatory to, and we actually haven't made a formal decision as a council to relinquish that, and it's a political decision. So I have a concern that in the partnerships and the international section, there's a lot more that we could put there. For example, there are Oceania programs, there's the Talanoa discussions that involve Fiji and Pacific islands. There are a whole bundle of things that should really inform our position. And in particular, one of the things that continues to be absent is our advocacy position. And what is important there, through you, Deputy Chair, is the increasing recognition that it is cities that have a role at the Conference of the Parties, for example, the COP talks and the like, and organisations like ICLEI in particular have played a role there. I certainly attended on more than one occasion, and that's now absent. And the other thing that is also not being covered off is our membership also of organisations, I'm assuming, like the Sustainable Business Council, the Green Business Council and the like, our engagement with other cities in New Zealand and our role there. So I'm just asking again, as I asked last time, can we actually fill this out so it's more comprehensive? Many of those organisations and partnerships are things that don't just exist for council, they exist for businesses, they can exist for communities and local boards, they exist for our relationship with other cities and especially advocacy. So I just invite a response around that.
Just to clarify the question.
The same question that I asked last time, can we have this information here? Because as it stands, it's absent, or it's woefully insufficient.
So through the chair, and yes, we have taken your comments on board in terms of trying to re-emphasise at a high level the role of cities, which you raised before in terms of leading and engaging in that dialogue, obviously recognising from a C40 perspective how much cities actually play in terms of emissions generation. In terms of specific details of organisations that we are or have been involved in, we haven't necessarily put it in here, partly because things change, things evolve, and we're trying to have an element of longevity around it. However, as we go to the digital side in a similar way that we can link through to local board plans, the most relevant organisations that we're part of, then there's nothing to stop us having that within the plan as it becomes a digital form.
The other question I've got just goes to page 59, and that mentions water. It doesn't mention the fact that we don't have a water strategy. There is no mention of water conservation and the embodied energy and carbon in water, which is hugely significant, and the huge savings that Auckland can make by reducing consumption of water and also wastewater, and the lead role that Auckland plays, because our strategies are then able to direct the CCOs.
So just a high level, I think we're conscious there is a water strategy under development. There is work going on there. What we have put in the plan is really that focus on alternative water supply options through that built environment priority, through the communities and coast side of things, and obviously individual habits cover there. But I think from our perspective, yes, climate, water are intrinsically interlinked. There is work ongoing to try and establish that strategy.
So, just through you, Mr. Chair, can we bolster that area? Because if there's one thing that's very topical right now that Aucklanders are familiar with, it's water, and I would suggest the need to conserve water. It also fits with Māori principles, iwi principles and the like. And if there's one thing we could be doing seriously right now, it's that, and it's not well covered. So I'm just making the request, Mr. Chair, if we could be a little bit more substantial there. And then the final question I've got, if I just go to the section that covers off towards the end around the current directions and frequency of reporting, for example. In many instances, under current direction, we've got either unknown or we're actually not monitoring. And these are, in many instances, very, very significant areas. So we're actually not monitoring. If we don't monitor, we actually can't manage, we can't meet goals. And so my question goes to a budgetary one. Are you going to be putting up through the LTP the resource requirements that we actually need to do this stuff seriously? And some of those numbers might be big. And again, Mr. Chair, I go back to the plea I make that we take a scenario-based approach to our LTP that will enable us to put some of these figures down. Because if we don't do that, we basically have an LTP where everything is constrained already by a budget and people don't even have a choice. So could we have that, Alec?
So through the chair, the way that we're thinking about it is obviously have a number of options. The best case in terms of what's our best foot forward, through to continuing as we do with no further investment with a number of options in the middle. Obviously, we'll bring that to committee and through this committee and obviously through finance and performance. But that is our intention, to make sure that we have a best foot forward. This is what we would need to do as an option.
Yes, and to back that up, Councillor Walker, we have been meeting for feels like years, but the last, definitely, throughout this year and even the end of last year, Tanya Stocks and now Lucy will take over that work from Tanya now she has left, and working with the team. There is a long list of very important goals and plans, budgets, ideas that will be going into the 10-year budget mix. And, thankfully this work has been going on so long that it's actually, I feel, going to be pretty exciting when we start getting very obvious moves through our 10-year budget that will make a big difference for climate. On top of the many things that have already been going on within the Council and CCOs already. So thank you for your questions, Councillor Walker, and your continued passion in this area. And Councillor Henderson.
Kia ora, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I've asked this before, but it's pretty important for council's future operations, and actually goes for local boards as well as council, ward council. We've heard from Canal Road this morning a conflict between economic reality and the environmental and climate change needs, and I've often talked about how people need to be paid, and so we have to assess things for economic reasons, but we need to start looking at assessing things in detail for climate change and environmental reasons as well when we're assessing a project. And the example that I always use is buses to Piha, which I think are a fantastic idea. We've got an area where major tourist attraction locally and internationally, and you have to drive. Now, looking at any given bus, I guarantee you we would struggle to get more than half full on that bus because not a lot of people live out there. But you need to be assessing, when you take X amount of vehicles off the road, that may have an economic impact, but it's got a huge environmental and climate change impact. So my question is, do we have the capability in the future to submit projects, not just for how much it's going to cost, but for its carbon assessment?
So two things. In what spare time we've had, so a member of the team, Jasmine, who's sitting behind us, has been working on, you'll recall as part of that climate emergency declaration, there was a climate impact statement requirement. We've been working on increasing the capability and the tools available to do that. Obviously, recognising not everyone in the organisation is an expert in climate change, we do need to increase that capability, both in terms of what are the emissions benefits, but also what are the impacts of climate change through the life of that decision. So there's a programme of both training, but then also tools, and I think part of that was in the emergency budget climate package. So that's one thing. The other thing, just to your initial points, and hopefully Perrin's still behind us, one of the actions in here is about economic shift. And how do we move to a more regenerative, distributive economy? And what does that look like for Auckland? So in that economy section, and that is critical because if we don't change the way that we assess projects, where we look at investment, then we're not going to achieve any of these goals. So I guess, yes, both of those areas are in here. I suppose the question is about accelerating that uptake.
That's wonderful. And just kind of a supplemental point that, yeah, not just ward councillors, but also local boards, particularly active ones like Puketapapa, for example. Yeah, they can say, look, we've got an idea for a project. We want to know how much it costs physically, but also how much it's going to cost environmentally. So the report thing is great because it looks backwards. Looking forwards is the next step.
Apologies, Sarah's just, did you want to...
I was just going to briefly interject there as well. So obviously we're aware those climate impact statements, like you say, they're looking backwards. They're coming almost at the end of the process. So we're looking at embedding that approach actually in the business case stage as well. So what are those key points across decision making right from the very inception of projects, and how do we make sure that's reflected so people don't come to do the report as hindsight, it's being built in. The other thing probably to be aware of is obviously we have the climate lane part of LTP, but we're also looking at a climate lens that we apply across all of those projects that go through LTP as well. So we're looking at embedding there as well and considering.
Thank you. Member Wilcox.
Thank you, Chair. I suppose I'm going to go straight away for my first question. Page 31, read about Council's partnership approach with mana whenua. And I suppose this fills on from Member Wilson's corridor about speaking to mana whenua as well as the Kaitiaki Forum. And I suppose I'll just add some context to that. And I suppose it's the right of every iwi and hapu to be engaged in the way they wish to be engaged. So I just want to kind of understand that, and that's my first question. Thank you.
Kia ora, Member Wilcox. So yeah, as we try to highlight through the development phase of the project, of the plan, we've obviously engaged with the Kaitiaki Forum, but we've also reached out to each of the different chairs of the various iwi. And right at the start, I think, was actually quite an open invitation to see who was interested in this piece of work and who would like to participate. So I think about 3 or 4 times through the process, we've engaged specific with mana whenua as well as through the forum. Most recently, as I noted earlier, in response to Member Wilson's comments, I personally reached out to every single iwi chair, have spoken directly to about half of those, not just about the plan, but about how we work going forward. So how we look at the LTP, how we look at localization. So I think Johnny mentioned, there's a regional piece, but there's also very local aspects. So yesterday I was down in Clevedon talking to Ngaitai, really interested in the work that is possible with Umapuia, coastal inundation and so on. They mentioned Deputy Chair Coombe coming out and very appreciative of that. Similarly, talking to Ngāti Tiata about some of the principles that they would like to see come through. So it's ongoing, and I think that's hopefully what we're trying to say here. It's been a good foundation. Hopefully it's been a good foundation, but we want to continue that discussion, that dialogue going forward.
So my question is, our statement, about to try and do actions that are equal and fair. I don't think we can ever be equal and fair. I mean, that's utopia. The reality is that some things aren't going to be equal or fair. That's life. And I suppose the other question I have about that is we mentioned the steel mill, but without steel, we don't have buildings. And to say, well, we shut the steel mill down or we make the steel mill uneconomic, then we go and buy steel from China. We're only transferring those carbon credits to somewhere else. So those carbon emissions to somewhere else. We're actually not achieving anything in a global scheme. So I suppose I just want to understand that kaupapa. Thank you.
And I guess, and appreciate, there is, as we said, we've tried to put a focus on equity. There is still a lot to do in the equity sense. And I think I've flagged this before. From our perspective, it's not, the first thing is to understand what the equity issues are. And what we've noted is that in delivering certain actions, say, for example, electric vehicles, it's great at reducing emissions, but there are equity issues. So we need to find ways of addressing those. And that might not specifically be through the electric vehicle action, but it might be about how you support communities in a different way. And so in recognising these different links, and hence it's really good to kind of take a more holistic Te Ao Māori view about what are the interlinkages, what are the different ways that this issue gets affected by a whole bunch of other things. In terms of the steel mill, look, we went down to Glenbrook to find out what they were looking to do, and totally appreciate your comment. And I don't think any of us are in that mode of saying, look, easy 15% when our emissions is to close the steel mill, because of that point about embodied emissions around steel and construction. And actually, to solve that problem, we need to look at the building sector, and we need to think about, well, how do we reduce steel use in the building sector before we even go down that route? So this is the complexity that we're trying to deal with, both in terms of how you reduce those emissions, but how you try and address those inequity either directly in that action or through other interventions.
Question? Yeah, so it's a question and a comment, and I suppose the comment is really we already are adapting. I mean, if people don't think the $240 million that was spent for water care to get water, part of that was adaptation to what's actually happening right now. And the billions of dollars that have gone on transport, if that hasn't been part of a climate change process, what we're doing is actually putting it on steroids. And, by 2050, and I saw the thing up there, 2020 or 2120, I mean, I'd love to be around then, but I don't know if it might be just the head like the Simpsons by then. But here we go. But I think, in the end, it's up to us to sell it to Aucklanders. In the end, it's a personal decision that will drive the plan and the personal decisions that we make. And so, we should not be using this plan, as it often happens with plans, as a blockage, but as an enabler for people to go forward. Unfortunately, a lot of council plans end up being blockages, but actually we want to enable this plan to be an enabler so that we create a sustainable region for the future. So I suppose that's where I'm coming from there, and that ensuring that occurs.
Just to say, yes, that's exactly what we want to use it for. And the comment about engaging Aucklanders, so I think, again, in the emergency budget, that was recognised as this conversation needs to happen. This hopefully gives direction, not just to Aucklanders individually, but businesses, civil society, and so on. These are the areas we need to focus on. These are the actions we need to do. But, you're right, a lot of it is about choice and change. And so we need to build Aucklanders up, because that LTP discussion is not going to be an easy one, and we need to make sure that Aucklanders are all fully armed with the implications of action as well as inaction if we don't do this. So I just, support what you're saying.
E mihi ana kia kōrua e haro mai ana kau e mai te kōrua ngā whānau e noho nei, mea koutou katoa kia ora mai tātou.
Kia ora. Thank you, Member Wilcox. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thanks, Chair Richard, and thanks, Alec, for the work you've done here. I'd just like a sense of truth here. So we've just lived through lockdown where the lights went out in industry, remote learning was taking place at schools and universities, people were working from home, everyone was working from home, still 30% apparently still are. Did you measure the drop in our trajectory for carbon then? And if so, that's what required to hit our targets?
So, through the chair, as you pointed out, clearly lockdown had a significant impact on our emissions. We could see through observation that our roads were at a standstill in terms of no traffic, but importantly also manufacturing shut down in the large, steel making also. So a significant drop in our emissions over that 6-week period. What we're seeing is levels returning to perhaps what they were before lockdown, perhaps slightly less, but the anticipation is around the same. So we could discuss whether it's a V-shaped bounce back, have we dropped and are we coming back? But I think your question, if I'm not mistaken, is that what climate action will look like in terms of the scale of change?
That degree of change, is that an idea of what would actually, did that trajectory, that change deliver that trajectory? I'm not saying that's the trajectory we want to follow, or the level of change we want to follow, but that drop off of economic activity, the drop off and all of those things, did that actually create the result that you're looking for in that carbon emission?
I don't believe it did create the result we're looking for, and the reason I say that is because the means in which we got to a decrease in emissions was very different. So we need to look at transport, certainly, but not stopping transport. We need to look at decarbonising transport. We need to look at continuing activities through low carbon, zero carbon energy. But in terms of, so the means of which we get there is very different. In terms of the scale of reduction that's required, certainly that is the trajectory that we'd be looking for in terms of...
That's the answer to the question I want. So that scale drop off, now it's about how do we actually get there without losing our economy, and that's the secret part about it. But that's the degree of change you're looking for. So it's massively significant.
Yeah. And
it's also the... Do you want to just maybe talk a little bit, Matthew, about the fact that you had an almost immediate effect on air quality, but that because of that carbon hangs around, we won't necessarily see any change in our carbon in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's a very good point. So certainly the monitoring of our air quality showed a marked improvement in terms of particulate matter and other gases that caused by traffic pollution, for example. Greenhouse gases are cumulative. We add to the total. We don't suddenly, they don't disperse in the same way that particulate matter does. So it's a very different scenario to what we experience in terms of air quality. And I think that is important to note, certainly.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Miguel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Alec and team, thank you very much. Document's 200 pages long, so I imagine there's not too many of our community that will be reading it from cover to cover. But you have produced for me something I asked for, which sets out in this A3 the 8 priority areas, and then what's council doing, what more do we need to do as council, what do we need the government to do, what do we need individuals to do, and what do we want business to do. And I think it's really, really helpful. I just wanted to check, has that gone to everybody around the table?
Not yet, no.
I think it's a great document. Could I encourage you to send that out? Because, I think what we're looking at now, you've done a whole lot of the homework, but we need to be able to communicate out to our public. And it needs to be something that involves everybody. So, what do we as Aucklanders do? How do you live lightly? What are the suggestions that we make to individual Aucklanders about what they could be doing? Because often, as an individual, you feel pretty powerless. It's all happening. What can I do? What difference can I make? And there are a whole lot of things. And likewise to business. And the council section's pretty helpful because it just reminds us of what we're doing and then tells us what the next step is and what we need to do. And that's kind of a preliminary to costing it and LTP, etc. But there's a whole lot of stuff in here that we are doing and can do that might not involve massive sums of money. So my question is, apart from, please circulate this to everyone, we need to actually, we've got to figure out our communication strategy, and mostly you use plain English. Every now and again I come across a section where I feel I need a thesaurus or something to work out what you're saying, but we need to get something out there that is reasonably, I know it's a complex area, but reasonably straightforward, simple, clear and precise. And I'd really encourage, I know we'll do it digitally, but there are a whole lot of people out there that want to see something that they can sit down and in 10 minutes get a sense of what we're doing, what they need to do, what we expect of business. So can you tell us a little bit about your plans for, okay, not just producing 200 pages digitally, I know that's easy, but I want to know how we're going to actually get stuff that we can get into our schools, into our communities, out to individuals, to households, etc.
Yeah, look, appreciate the comments, Mayor Goff, and great that you found the document useful. So the work that's going on with our kind of comms team is very much around that. And I think if I'm going to say, if anyone had solved the comms picture around climate change, we wouldn't be in this problem now, because the issue that you're talking about isn't just one that council faces, it's one that we're facing around New Zealand and around the world. So we're working with the comms team to try and articulate, well, actually, what is the message? What are we trying to ask for? I think, and it's always, that focus helps. So the direction you gave us to kind of try and bed down into that table has been really useful, and I think that's been helpful for our comms team in terms of actually understanding what are the things we're trying to ask for. The other bit is, how do we ask that? What are the mechanisms, what are the forums? So what I've started to do, now that we're hopefully in a position where we have the nuts and bolts of this plan, is to go out to our various partners, the likes of the Sustainable Business Network, Sustainable Business Council, Green Building Council, and so on, try and say, well, okay, this is what we see as a region. What are the channels? What are the different mechanisms that you need to engage? How do we embed that message? Obviously, we have the Live Lightly program as a way to focus in on communities. I think some of the messaging that's in that plan, hopefully, that work can hopefully be informed by the focus that we're saying here. So I guess just the final thing is, I think in the emergency budget or the proposals, there was that focus on the communications campaign, and that's the thinking that we need to do. So we've got the content, I suppose. I'm hoping that we've got the content. The team there are helping with simplification, because I recognise that we kind of sit probably in a probably overly complex level. But how do we get that down? And actually, I'd call that out to all the people around this table. And I know I've had various discussions about how we communicate to the south is very different to the west and to the north and so on. So that's the work that we have to do over the next, I think, 3 to 4 months prior to that LTP discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I just add one other comment to it. The only suggestion I'd add to this is most people now do accept that climate change is real, but there isn't the sense of emergency that we passed in our resolution or that surrounded our budget. So I think we need something on the why, and there's some dramatic stuff coming through. And, you're asking people to change their lives, and you're asking them to pay for things that need to be done fundamentally differently. We've got to create that sense of urgency and give them the information of the why. And the one other column that actually we need for our own sake is not just what is council doing, what we need to do as council, but a progress update, so that we can actually see how far we're moving forward. And I think that's a vital section. But congratulations on that. I think it's good. Please circulate it to everybody. And then we've got to go out and we've got to communicate. And the schools will be. Look, what makes me really hopeful is that I know the schools are actually doing so much there. So you ask a 10-year-old about climate change, they'll tell you more than a 60-year-old will.
Thank you, Mayor Goff. Councillor Darby.
Thanks, Chair. And thanks, Alec, the whole team. Mana whenua a bit involved. This is a phenomenal day, really. But this is just the beginning. This is really comprehensive. I think it's taken us 2 years to get here. And I look back, this city's been in existence, the new structure, for 10 years. And if you fast forward that same period, 10 years, we've got to hit some really, they're not ambitious, they're necessary targets. They are necessary targets. Ambitious almost excuses them if you miss them. We can't miss this, right? We can't miss this. So I think about, Chair, that the City Rail Link took 94 years to achieve. This plan took 2 years. If I look at our acknowledgement of Māori, it's taken us 10 years to really get up to pace. It's taken us probably 8 to 10 years to recognise the importance of urban design. And I look at our own organisation and I think, and this is where my question is, because I look at this document and I cannot fault it now, Alec. I think you've landed something that gives us a very solid platform to launch from. But I am probably critical of our ability, of this organisation, of Auckland Council, which at times has so much clay and lead in it. And it's about, I guess my question is about the culture. How do you shift the culture of this organisation? So that's not reflected in the plan. It's about people. It's about people being glued to what's familiar and what they like and their inability to maybe really shunt forward. So how do you audit that? How do you create a massive shift in the systems to take off? Because we can't afford a slow takeoff. This has to be a launch. So how do you change the culture of Auckland Council? Sorry. How do we change the culture of Auckland Council?
So, geez, that's a big question. Look, look, we don't have a lot of time, and you're right in terms of, as an organisation, and I say this for not just Auckland Council, but councils generally, quite conservative, very rules orientated. You've heard a little bit about the work that we're trying to push through in terms of the existing systems, so those business cases and so on. I genuinely believe that the people are really enthusiastic. There are some really great people in this organisation who want to make change. And I think your analogy of clay is probably the right one. I don't want to say too much, but that will mean that I'm not here. But we've got a new CEO coming in. And there's an opportunity there to set that direction about what is really important and how do we drive that through the organisation from top to bottom. I think we need to make the most of that. And I think that, yes, we address the processes, but to your point, let's make sure those ideas bubble up to the top and that actually we're doing some really great stuff. So from my lens, work outside of council that I've done previously, the big thing about change in an organisation is a purpose-led organisation and a really strong purpose. And council should have the strongest purpose in terms of delivering a great city. And once you can clarify that purpose and get everyone behind that purpose, then the organisation shifts as well. So I think we have an opportunity in the plan in terms of what it sets out. We have an opportunity organisationally in terms of, reflecting post-COVID. What are the things that we need to do? We have new leadership coming in. So I think those are real opportunities, but we have to seize them. To your point, we don't have time to kind of think for the next 5 years about how we might implement this plan.
Thank you. Councillor Walker, you've had quite a number of questions. Could you just try and keep it tight so we can... So there's still another question from Councillor... Sorry, you're on the first on the speaking list then. Councillor Simpson, question.
Oh, look, thank you, and congratulations on the work that you've done. It's great to see. Look, my question is around transport. It's kind of the worst of everything, isn't it? And my problem is financially, an electric bus is hugely expensive and far greater than a horrible, smelly diesel bus. But for some areas, don't even have a bus. It's kind of better than, what's the best option? So my question to you is, that's going to be a real challenge for council. And when you look around the world at other countries that have made larger steps to, as far as climate goes, really, they've sort of, I won't say been ahead of us, because I think every country in the world's trying to sort of catch up. Is there any way that, how long does it take them to get that bus electrification embedded in their city because of cost. Do you have any idea around that? Because that's really bothering me, Mr. Chair. It is. They're very, very expensive, and yet we want to try and do the right thing, but we don't have any buses somewhere.
Just hurriedly looking for Ryan, who leads on climate and transport, just in case he can provide some colour to that.
Thank you for the question. Through the chair. Look, it's not easy and it takes time. In terms of replacing a bus fleet, there's a number of different ways through which this would be facilitated, and it is a period of time that this occurs. So at the moment, our roadmap via the AT endorsed, board endorsed, bus roadmap looks at 2025 onwards. From the perspective of cost, there's of course the upfront capital cost. The other variable, of course, is OPEX and operational costs. So over the time, the potential for reduced OPEX through the use of electricity as opposed to diesel as a fuel. And over time as well, we would see improvements, or certainly a high expectation of improvement in technology in terms of battery technology and vehicle technology, bringing the capital cost of vehicle purchase down. So it is a matter of timing. In terms of information that I've seen overseas, this could certainly be supplemented by Auckland Transport, who are looking into this in a lot of detail. But certainly from what I've seen overseas, there's a lot of central government support for programs where there has been a lot of onus on electrification generally, not just for buses, but for fleet generally speaking. And I'll certainly point to some points that other members have made, councillors have made today, around that need for broader support. So it's not just about council and council making decisions around what we want to fund, but it's also a significant amount of support from central government to progress some of these programs, electrification of fleet being one of them.
I think that's where I was heading, and you've headed in the same direction, so thank you.
Ryan, in my discussions with AT, that there's apparently a 60% decrease ballpark on operational cost over time. So obviously capital up front is a lot more, but is that the sort of numbers you've been looking at too, that when you electrify those buses, the running costs are 60% lower?
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't give you an exact figure, but there's certainly there's that delta. And as I mentioned, we certainly anticipate that delta improving over time. So in other words, the operational benefits being there, but that capital, so that upfront cost also reducing towards being more in line with the existing purchase price around diesel vehicles.
Thank you. Last, I think, but not least, Councillor Newman, you're Skyping in. Got a question?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I don't know if you can hear me, but I have a go.
Yes,
look,
we can.
Councillor Simpson kind of touched on it in terms of what she said, but I'd like to ask the staff in adopting the plan to help me out here. For those of us who represent outer suburban wards where bus services don't exist, we've got tens of thousands of residents who are making decisions around transport that are not based on choice. In fact, they're based on lack of choice. So I guess really, in an environment where we are horribly constrained by the budget in a post-COVID-19 world, but actually we were constrained beforehand given the lack of funding for new contracted services. How do we actually provide greater choice to those people who currently don't have the option of an easy switch in transport mode from private motor vehicle to public transport?
Thank you, Councillor Newman. Through the chair, look, the broad perspective here is that what we're really talking about is a systems approach. So recognising that there are differences in terms of choice across the region. There is no one size fits all in terms of a response here. So from the perspective of systems change, in part we are talking about how we make decisions around supplying transport, and that includes public transport, includes improving active transport and those sorts of things. But we're also talking about, to the extent it's reasonable, having that conversation with the Aucklanders about the choices that they can make and the discretion that they can exercise. And then more broadly, again, it's about the nature of the travel that we do undertake and the types of vehicles that we use to undertake that travel over time, obviously that improving. And again, there's a significant amount of support we would be looking for from government, because council can show a lot of leadership, advocacy and influence, but ultimately in terms of a range of budget decisions, we're looking to central government for that support. So certainly there's no quick fix to this, and there's certainly not a single fix. So my perspective would be incremental change and looking at change in a variety of different ways.
And in the continuum of incremental change, how does one prioritise the provision of services to increase choice, or to provide choice to people who currently don't have it? Because that's a challenge, isn't it? We can improve the efficiency and reduce the emissions on our vehicle fleet. We can make progress, quite quick progress, to services that we currently provide. But what about those people who don't have it? And I guess maybe it's a point of debate, or maybe it's going to be a difficult one for you to answer. But when do we prioritise those people who don't have the choice to begin with? Because that's more than incremental, that's actually quite significant. But it has been an inconvenient gap that has not been addressed to date. But I want to thank you for your reflections. I think it's something that we'll need to continue to debate when we do the next RPTP and discussions with Auckland Transport. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Newman. Right, so I will move the recommendations on the board, and our Deputy Chair Pipakun would like to second. And I've spoken many times on this, so I won't speak at the beginning and the end. I'll have some comments at the end, but we'll kick off with Councillor Walker, who's put his hand up first.
So I'm really encouraged that we've got this this document, which follows on from an early document that I was involved with. If I go back to 2010, when Len Brown was elected, one of his critical platforms was reducing emissions by 30% by 2020. I'll repeat that. Reducing emissions by 30% by 2020. And there was a report done, it was a desktop report by Arup that demonstrated that, yes, we could actually meet that, and there were some costs. Fast forward to today, and it's 10 years on, and I think our emissions have gone up by at least 10%. I could be wrong, I'm looking at the annual gross emissions. So we're 40% behind where Len Brown was suggesting that we're going to be. And I just mention this because this is really serious. I mean, really serious. And one of the points that I'm making, which is around my plea for engaging with other cities and collaboration and the like, is one of the most important things is benchmarking. And if we assess Auckland against other cities, there are any number of cities, many of us have probably visited them, that have got emissions trajectories that are going down. They've actually met targets. I could rattle off a whole lot of these cities. They're marvellous places to visit. They're very livable, and we're going in the opposite direction. So this is not something to be smug about. It's incredibly serious. And I can only conclude that we've got structural problems in our organisation that are preventing this. In part, those structural problems go to us, and I think the lack of adequate leadership on our part. They go to the organisation as a whole. I don't think that they're reflective entirely of Aucklanders, because I think Aucklanders are actually up for it. So we're not doing it, and this is a huge concern. So I have a suggestion, and that is that both in respect of mitigation, climate change mitigation, and adaptation, we need to put these things on our risk register, because they should be there in terms of our audit function. Because quite obviously, we are not doing it. We're not doing it around mitigation, and in terms of adaptation, we've got a truck that's coming to us, and it ain't an electric truck either. It's a really heavy gas-guzzling beast that's going to knock us over, and in terms of budgetary cost, it is immense. So this plan is very focused on mitigation. There's not too much in here on adaptation. It's a major, and we are woefully unprepared for that compared to other cities. So can we put stuff on the benchmark? I think if the audit people, Mark Maloney and others, are listening to this, and the chief executive, I'd make a plea, because then the chief executive is empowered and engaged, and so is the organisation, to reduce our risks. And this is the biggest risk I'd suggest we face. I've made a plea for collaboration, for international collaboration, for advocacy, for membership. Earlier we've had opportunities to participate in water-sensitive cities, resilient cities programs, equally sustainable procurement, eco-mobility, the list goes on. We don't do those things. We actually don't want to benchmark ourselves in many instances, and maybe that's because we don't want to see what the results are. But we need to do that. And if I come back to a moment that we have right now, which is around our water crisis, where we have an opportunity to significantly reduce demand and lock it in, which will dent the revenue line of water care temporarily, but will mean that we are much better off financially, far more resilient. I ask fellow councillors, are we actually going to do that? When I asked the question of Ravine, did we have any best practice around water conservation or water for any industry, any sector? The short answer was no, nothing. So if there's one area where we need a strategy and we need to be doing stuff and we need to be benchmarking it, from a carbon perspective, that's it. And I guess the other plea that I make is in respect of the team that Alec and so on amount to, and it's a good team and there's some good people there. If you benchmark that team against the teams in other cities, we're tiny. So let's actually do that. Can we have some very real benchmarking? And we might not like the answers, but I don't want to be around in another 10 years' time in a circumstance where our trajectory has continued to go up, and I don't think that Aucklanders want that, and certainly the young people, thank goodness, that are part of the school actions and so on. So I just hope that we can do it. But we're going to need resources, and we're going to need to apply them through the long-term plan, and we're going to have to be serious.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. And just to clarify, I was on the Audit and Risk Committee last term, and climate change is in there highly on the register, both adaptation and the emissions. And I think it was Councillor Darby who last term was concerned it wasn't registered high enough, and Bill and others got it moved from medium to high risk on all levels. So it's definitely in there. And as of this year, we've got that financial reporting for the first time ever. So it is there, and it's definitely there. So thank you, Councillor Walker. Councillor Deputy Chair Pipakum.
Tēnā koe, Mr Chair. Tēnā te mihi nui ki a koutou. I very much would like to speak in support of adopting Te Tāruki a Tāwhiri, Auckland's climate plan, and support the kaupapa of the work that's being brought to us today. We very much saw in our response to COVID-19 that when we all come together, we can really respond to a crisis quite phenomenally, and how that has meant that we are safe in Aotearoa, and that we can actually enjoy quite a normal life right now, because we actually took the seriousness of the threat and responded just in an absolutely incredible way. And I feel that we can do this with the climate emergency, but we're going to take a real a response that brings us all together in terms of recognising the risk that is absolutely very stark and coming at us very, very quickly. And we heard in terms of the speaker from Generation Zero, and I thank Olivia for coming today and supporting the action plan in terms of how this crisis intersects with many other crises that we're seeing. So in looking at the responses that we had on our emergency budget, I read those submissions very carefully, and there was such an overwhelming sense that we have to do things differently, and we very much have to respond to the climate crisis in terms of the actions of council going forward. There was also, of course, a lot of concern about how we set a path that means that we build on the momentum of the lockdown and our response to the crisis. And we look at doing things differently. And it is going to require bold, rapid action. And I think this plan brings that together. We've heard in terms of the comments about how this plan has landed in a really good place. And it really does make us address this sense of urgency that we have before us. And I don't think that the Mayor mentioned that we really need to get that message across, that if we're going to decarbonise, for example, transport in 10 years, which is required to meet our 2030 target, that is actually going to take an absolute change in everything that we do. And that's across all of these priority areas. So I did just want to mention about that feedback on the submissions. I know, and also what we put together last week with the emergency budget. There was a lot of speeches last week, but we landed in a really good place with that budget in terms of responding to the crisis that was in front of us in that big budget hole. But what we really need to do, we have to ensure that that sets us on a foundation for the long-term plan, for the 10-year budget, and that budget becomes a climate budget. It's got to be our climate action budget. And so many of these actions at the moment, they are unfunded. We know it's got to be a collaborative approach across all of our sectors, engaging our community, NGOs, Māori, mana whenua, if we are actually going to succeed in terms of meeting our zero carbon emissions by 2050. It is a really big goal, but I feel that this plan puts us in a very strong place. Just want to acknowledge everybody who's worked on the plan to bring it to this point. I know that this journey has been a 2-year one in terms of Te Taruki a Tawhiri, but that the founders go back a lot further than that. Councillor Walker acknowledged your work in the first term in terms of the low carbon plan, Auckland's first plan, as a super city. I do come from the Waitemata local board, of course, and I have to do a plug that we were the first local board that drafted a low carbon plan, and it's great to see that the Waitemata low carbon network is still going strong, and thank you for those members who came along today from the Equal Justice Project and the support that they get from Grant Hewitson. And of course, I've got to acknowledge those people who kicked off this process, particularly the former Deputy Mayor Penny Hulse, Councillor Alf, all of those councillors who were part of that initial process. I'd like to acknowledge all of the officers that have been involved, and particularly John Moreau, who is our first Chief Sustainability Officer, and he has contacted me to say that he has been listening in from his little corner in the United States, because he recognises that this is a really significant day for Auckland Council. We're bringing this plan to be approved. I'd also really like to acknowledge the mana whenua input into this process. It was great to hear, Johnny, I think it was you said that it's not just been about engagement, but it's also been about holding the pen. And from my perspective, looking from the outside, it has seemed that I've never seen a plan that seems to embrace Te Ao Māori so comprehensively in terms of the principles and how it's interwoven into the plan and also going forward. So I hope we can keep that partnership really strong. So I'd like to thank all that work from our mana whenua partners. And I would like just to acknowledge too, if I may, just the rangatahi who've been involved in this plan, in the process and in the engagement, and all of those young leaders who brought to council the resolution to acknowledge the climate emergency, which was only a little over a year ago, I think. But they really brought it to council in terms of the urgency of this kaupapa. Many of those school strike for climate leaders are now stepping into local government and in other leadership positions. So I do want to thank them and everybody who has brought this plan to us today. And I did have to mention that our colleague, Councillor Tracy Mulholland, left and said to me, please, can you tell everybody that she supports the plan? I don't have a proxy vote for her, unfortunately. It doesn't work like that. But she had to go for council business, so she did just want me to make that mention. So if I leave it there, very much support that we commend to all my colleagues, councillors and IMSB member Wilcox, that we adopt Te Taruki a Tough Whiri. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Councillor Dalton, you got being beamed in, and thank you for your message. I just read it.
Oh, great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Italy Local Board Office.
Perfect, we can hear you.
Thank you. Look, just wanted to say congratulations to Alex and the team for this plan, which I'm grateful to have the opportunity to support. And congratulations, Chair, and to Councillor Coombe as well on your leadership of this and your willingness to be inclusive. You ensured received a reasonably smooth ride through, though you've had quite a long discussion about it this morning, which has been great and really interesting. And I just want to say how much I enjoy Councillor Walker's passion for this kaupapa and his call for accountability to all of the issues and all of the surrounding factors. I always learn so much from listening to Councillor Walker. Look, my plea is to be true to the equity lens in this plan. Don't leave anyone behind, and please ensure that the measure of success
Sorry, Councillor Dalton, we lost you at the measure of success, and it sounded like you were really getting there and we lost you. So if you just want to start again from that point.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I just saying that I'd like to ensure that there is equity across Auckland for the targets, and I was really picking up on what Councillor Newman mentioned about transport earlier, but we do have the equity lens in there, and I want to ensure that we are applying this, and that's reflected in the LTP. So we can ensure that this plan is going to guide so much of our future decision making over policy. Just finally and quickly, look, I agree with the Mayor that we can take heart that a 6-year-old knows more than a 60-year-old in this space. It certainly has been my experience in recycling with my own grandchildren. So, to that end, I'd hope to see more community and iwi mātāwaka-led leadership to ensure that this kaupapa is embedded at the grassroots where it matters the most. So thank you to everybody. I've sort of come in at the very end of all of this in terms of how long you've been working on it. But what an amazing job, a huge piece of work. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Dalton. Councillor Henderson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just very quickly, I firstly want to just congratulate staff, Chair and Deputy Chair of this committee for all of your hard work on this kaupapa. Heading off the apocalypse is no small feat. Well done. This could be the most important work that we look back on in the decades to come and hopefully smile about. through this work, I want to make clear that I want to empower local boards, as I've mentioned, to look at projects and initiatives that they can do locally to both mitigate climate change's effects, but also to increase that conversation and community knowledge. The other scrap of thought I had was the equity lens, and the evidence is very clear that poorer communities will be hit harder by climate change's effects. And so our actions around this table going into the future need to reflect that reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Henderson. Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Just very, very briefly, I asked the question about the trajectory because I think that brings home the reality and the seriousness of the whole discussion that we're having. It's, you know, COVID didn't bring us together, it kept us apart. What brought us together was the team of 5 million that actually made the result work as far as the health's concerned. So we don't want to do that sort of thing as a financial economic experiment to get carbon out. So we've got to find a smarter way through. I guess the only point I'm going to make is it's not up for someone else to do it. It's up for every one of us to do their bit. And some will have to probably do a little bit more than others to make it happen. So if you're going to keep the steel mill going, someone else is going to have to carry a bit of a heavier load to enable us to have that critical industry supplying more materials to our builds. And the same thing goes for heavy construction materials and our infrastructure networks. So to get to those levels of carbon reductions, it's going to take some serious pain and some serious thinking to retain our economic viability and sustainability as a nation. So it's not my job, it's not your job, Alex, it's not the Mayor's job, it's all of our jobs. And then, together, you probably can do it.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Right, well, thank you. Councillor Darby.
Yeah, look, it has been a long innings. It's started with Councillor Penny Hulse as chair and Councillor Al Filipino, I want to acknowledge them, and now with you, Chair, bringing it through, bringing the runs home. But I do want to reflect on John Moreau's contribution here. He's up there in a lovely place called Port Townsend, which I know well, used to live there, and leading a small city there now. But and he's handed that task to Alec and his team, and I've got a lot of confidence in you, Alec, and your team, and you've brought this to us now, and I think it is, as I said before, it is looking a good place to launch out of. And I do want to be pretty frank though, Chair, about what I sense is, there's a certain inertia in the Auckland Council that we really do deliberately need to change the culture of the place if we are going to accelerate out of this launching pad. Now, that is not just a criticism of the organisation, and for me not to take criticism as well, because I'm in the governance of the shaping of how the management responds to political direction. But I stress again that we'd actually have very little time. So we're going to go into a budget setting next year. Well, we're going into it in about 2 weeks, actually. And we are going to have to pony up on our words, without doubt. And there cannot be any excuse making. I mean, if this is the emergency focus, as we committed to in a unanimous vote, we cannot create any excuses. There's no backaways. There will be budget constraints, but let's look at those constraints and still navigate the way forward. We are going to have to look at our strategic plans right across this organisation, and we are going to have to reset. And that's an enormous task itself. But I do stress that we are going to have to change this organisation now. Yes, we've got a new chief executive, but we can't just rely on the new chief executive. There's got to be a willingness from executive leadership team right down through the ranks, if I can say, and politically as well, to shift the dial. And in some instances where, some people are going to have to get out of the way and allow the voice of the young people on our staff to come forward, because they are the ones that are, champing at the bit to make sure that we do follow through here. That's my sense. So we've got an enormous task in front of us. But we're going to have to, in addition to this plan, we are going to have to reshape how we do our business here at Auckland Council. We can't do it like we did the City Rail Link, which took 94 years, or the other things I referred to earlier. This is out of the blocks and at it right now, as of today.
Thank you, Councillor Darby. Cool. Well, thank you, committee members, and yeah, thank you to all the staff who've worked on this, including John, who's beaming in, but Alex, Sarah, and Matt. I know, Sarah, sometimes you're working throughout the night to get us the plan redone, several times. So thank you all, the whole team, that not just sitting here, but everyone who's been doing the work on this plan for a long time. I know it hasn't been easy and it's very complex. It's hundreds of pages, but that is because that is the nature of the task ahead. It's not just a few quick moves, and it's not just a few solar panels stuck on a library and that's our job done. It's actually very complex to change the whole way we are doing everything. I want to thank mana whenua. I want to thank the Mana Whenua Kaitiaki Forum, Mā Tāwaka, all the rangatahi who came and stood here last year, and many Māori across Tāmaki who submitted quite loudly, and for the one of the first times in a significant number. And as partners with Mana Whenua, it is crucial that we have you on board, and that we are listening to you and we are working with you, and also looking back to the many, many different ways that you look at Papatūānuku, and you look at the way that we do things, and we look back at some of the traditional ways that the land was looked after before we were here, to improve our environment and to actually fix our climate. To Councillor Penny Hulse and ex-councillor, Penny Hulse and Al Filipaina for kicking this work off last term. Like, the leadership was needed then, and it's needed now. So thank you very much. For Councillor Coombe as the Deputy Chair, thank you so much for coming, and you've been speaking about this for a long time, but coming into this committee and really pushing. Big thanks to the people for years and years. There's, this is quite easy for us at the moment. For me, climate change is number one, or up there in the handful of priorities for most people now, and it is not seen as a fringe issue that we just tag on to things. There's been decades and decades of people saying that this is an important issue, that we must be dealing with this, that, presidential elections in the US have been talking about this for decades. There's been all sorts of climate leaders and activists throughout our country who've been saying that this is what we've needed to do for a very long time. And probably if we started then, we'd be in a much better position now. To the 75,000, not all, but mostly young people, but a lot of people from all ages and backgrounds who marched down Queen Street in March last year, and also September. Many of us marched with them, and it was, a pretty strong message that we needed to do something. And, if we weren't going to be listening to, they were going to bang down these doors until we did, because, it is the future of our city that we are talking about. Thank you to everyone around this table, and the councillors, IMSB, the local boards, everyone who's been really supportive. And, to Councillor Simpson, I think there were some discussions around potentially, having to remove the climate, the budgets for the climate actions in this year's annual budget because of what we were facing. But Desley said to me that she looked through the local board feedback and the feedback across Auckland, and it's actually climate change over and over and over came up as a priority that we needed to act on. So thank you to you and Shane and the Mayor for keeping those things in there. I guess, the need to act is clear. And I said actually at the beginning of when I became chair of this committee that I wouldn't talk about the bad things, because that is the scare tactic that everyone uses. But I don't think we can ignore the 1 in 200 year drought we are facing right now, the 1 in 500 year flood and rain event we had in Titai Tokoro over the weekend. The fires in Australia, our sky turned red. It was the weirdest, bizarrest thing I've ever seen. And those fires were hotter, stronger, bigger, faster than we've ever seen before. So, if this is our 1 in 200 year, 1 in 500 year, it's pretty clear that is probably going to be a 1 in 5 year, a 1 in 2 year. These things are going to continue to happen if we continue to do nothing or continue just to work around the edges. So, I think we need to assume that we have to do this work. It's not a choice. And I will say that I did say to John and the team last year when I was a committee member was, bring it to us strong and we'll probably water it down. Because that is what happens sometimes in council, as Councillor Darby said. But I will say that none of us have watered it down. Actually, we strengthened it. Last March, just before COVID hit us, we unanimously supported halving our emissions by 2030. I could not have said that we would have got a unanimous vote on that even a year ago. So I think that is pretty awesome, but it also shows that, a couple of years ago, I didn't think we could get here, and we're here. So we're responsible not for everything in this plan. We cannot possibly do it. If it was just council's plan, that would be fairly easy. We would just cut our emissions, but it is Auckland's plan. But I think we're kidding ourselves to think that we are the only ones, or we're the first ones, or we're the first out of the blocks. Business, community groups, mana whenua, people everywhere are already doing this work. They're well ahead of us. There's 110 members of the Climate Alliance for Auckland who are doing, you can look that up, myriad of things and examples that we should be taking on as well. X-Labs, just before COVID hit, I went and spoke, and there was businesses of all types working together for a better climate future and really changing the way they procure, the way they do things, the way they use waste. So it's not us forcing business into this. I think a lot of the time business are going, where's the leadership from us? Obviously, there are the things we need to do, the direct control that is public transport. In here, it's not going to be easy. We've got replacing 75% of gas heaters across residential and commercial buildings. We've got transport. We've seen with COVID we can do it, and we need to not return back to, we need not demand, which we haven't in this organisation. We had 6,500 people work from home overnight, and we should not be, and I hope we aren't, demanding all those people come back to work 5 days a week as per normal. Flexibility, it's about reducing those trips that is going to make the most effect. We're going to have to move our public transport mode share from 7.8% to 35% by 2050, but by 25% by 2030. That looks fairly impossible, but who would have thought 10 years ago that we would go from 55 million trips a year to 100 million trips a year in just 10 years? So it shows the investment, when we do it, it works. Cycling mode share, we're going to have to invest more in that. 100% increase in, a complete overhaul of our bus fleet. That is a cost, but as Shane Henderson said earlier, that we need to be measuring things not just on the economic cost, but the cost to the environment, the cost to our water quality, the cost to our air quality. Those are all the co-benefits of reducing emissions. I could list and list and list the things in our direct control. The others are our levers. So, we are going to have to, whoever is elected in September, really, really focus on their work on electric vehicles. We're not going to change the dial at all with public transport and walking and cycling if we don't have significant investment or change in the way electric vehicles come into this country and are changed out with the diesel and petrol cars. Because at the moment, it is to what Angela and, Councillor Dalton and Councillor Newman say, it is, we cannot create two worlds where we are having the wealthy being able to act on climate and those people who can't still not being able to play their part. But as we see by the submissions, that it is people from all across, all backgrounds of our city that want us to do the action, but we have to work with everyone. So we'll be advocating, we'll be using our levers, there'll be a review of the unitary plan. We've got to plant 19,000 hectares of trees in the next few years. So it's the cost of not doing it, to me, is worse. And if we're looking at our water care spend, Councillor Walker, we just spent $224 million in 1 year to deal with, in my belief, and I'm sure the science will back it up, a climate event. So we somehow found the money very difficultly. It was very difficult to find that that 224 million, but this is a 1 in 200 year drought we had to deal with, and we found that money. We don't want to keep finding emergency money. We want to actually, I think, take some of that money out, stop doing the same things over and over, and actually change our city for the better, because people want us to do it. So we can show the leadership, and I think we are, but it's actually working with everyone else. So thank you very much. I'm really, really excited about this. We've got Lucy Hallcroft sitting there has got a big job ahead with us to get that in the 10-year budget next year. That's the next big step when we completely reform the whole way we're doing things. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you support it. Thank you. All those in favour? Those against? Can I say that was carried unanimously? Thank you. And now we will go have a bite to eat. So thank you very much. In half an hour, so 1:45.